The night a woman misses a train, her whole life derails. In Gilded Age, New York, Tabitha Winslow returns home through a snowstorm, expecting warmth and safety, and instead opens a bedroom door onto the kind of betrayal that shatters not only a marriage, but the very idea of who she is. From that moment, every glance, every whisper, every choice pulls her between the ghosts of her past and a dangerous new promise of freedom and love. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and answer this. In historical romances, do you prefer love that rescues or love that awakens? New York City, December of the year 1889. The gaslights flickered under the weight of the snowstorm that had descended over Manhattan without warning. The streets were cloaked in silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves on packed slush and the distant chime of bells from Trinity Church. From the iron arches of Grand Central Depot to the gilded rooftops of Fifth Avenue, the city seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a hush of white and shadow. Tabitha Winslow stood beneath the overhang of the depot's side entrance, her gloved hands curled tightly around a folded parasol she no longer needed. The train to her home in Fifth Avenue had left without her, a delay at her aunt's parlor, a conversation that went too long, a carriage that arrived too late. Snow swirled around her in soft spirals as she gave the driver her address. She said nothing during the journey, but her heart beat with an odd restlessness, as though the night itself were warning her of something she could not yet name. The Winslow residence stood tall among the row houses of Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade kissed with frost, its windows aglow with amber light. From the outside, it looked like a portrait of domestic harmony, but as the driver helped her down, a shiver, colder than the wind, touched her spine. She dismissed it. Inside, the warmth of the foyer wrapped around her like a blanket. A faint trail of music floated from the drawing room, a piano playing softly, imperfectly. Odd. Charles rarely allowed the staff to play when they thought he might be working. And yet, the sound was there, clumsy and unfinished, like someone practicing while distracted. She handed her coat to the maid on duty, who looked surprised to see her. "Didn't expect you back tonight, madam," the girl whispered, eyes lowered. "The storm—" Tabitha nodded, unfastening the buttons of her gloves one by one. "Neither did I." She crossed the marble-floored corridor quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs imported from Paris. As she ascended the staircase, she felt it again, that strange stillness in the air, a pause that did not belong. The upper hall was dim, lit only by a flickering sconce. Her bedroom door stood ajar. She reached for the handle. A soft laugh drifted from within, a woman's laugh. Tabitha's hand froze. She pushed the door open, and in that instant, the world she knew ceased to exist. The room was warm, too warm, as though bodies had tangled for hours beneath the thick velvet covers of their marital bed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden shadows over the damask wallpaper. And on the bed, half covered and laughing still, lay Evelyn Pierce, her friend, her confidant, the woman who had once braided Tabitha's hair and whispered secrets in her ear like a sister. And beside her, shirt unbuttoned and lips smug, sat Charles Winslow. He did not flinch. He did not even blink. Tabitha stood motionless at the threshold, unable to move, unable to breathe. "Tabitha," Charles said at last, voice casual, as though greeting her in the parlor. "You weren't expected." Evelyn stretched like a cat in silk, her honey-blonde hair spilling over the pillows, her lips curved into a smile sharp as glass. "Oh, darling," she purred. "I thought she was staying the night with that tiresome aunt of hers." Tabitha said nothing. Her gaze flicked between them, between the warmth of the fire and the ice now forming in her chest. Every detail pressed into her mind like a blade. Evelyn's slipper on the floor, Charles's cravat tossed carelessly over the armchair, the scent of rosewater and smoke lingering in the air. She stepped back, neither of them followed. Descending the stairs felt like falling through water. The house, once her sanctuary, now pulsed with betrayal in every brick and corner. The music had stopped. The silence was now complete. Tabitha did not cry, not yet. Instead, she opened the guest bedroom door, a room she had never used, and entered as though crossing a threshold into another life. She sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, still wearing her boots, her gloves, her quiet dignity. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow clung to the window panes like frost-bitten lace. The gaslight across the street flickered once and went out. And inside, Tabitha Winslow stared into the darkness, her hands clasped in her lap, and understood with painful clarity that something precious had been broken. Not just a vow, not just a marriage, but a part of herself she had believed unshakable. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not yet know what she would become, but she knew she would never return to the woman she was before she opened that door. New York City, winter of 1889. The days that followed were carved in silence. The Winslow residence, once a stage for society's murmurings and spectacles, had fallen into a hush so absolute it pressed upon Tabitha Winslow like the weight of a tomb. Her footsteps echoed against parquet floors where once laughter had danced. Now even the staff avoided her eyes, their movements quiet, their presence vanishing like breath on a cold window pane. Charles did not speak of the night she returned unexpectedly. He carried on with the performance of a man aggrieved by domestic inconvenience. He rose at dawn, left his breakfast half-touched, and returned well after dusk, smelling of smoke, whiskey, and unfamiliar perfume. When he did speak, it was with vague condescension or calculated civility, as though she were some house guest who had overstayed her welcome. "You haven't been sleeping," he said one morning without looking at her. "You should see someone. You're beginning to look unwell." Hysterical even, Tabitha made no reply. She merely folded her napkin, set it beside her untouched teacup, and left the room. Inside her, the silence was growing into something larger than grief. It was not numbness. No, numbness implied dullness. This was sharper than sorrow, more refined than rage. It was clarity, bitter and pure. She no longer cried. There were no tears left after the first sleepless night, no room for weeping beneath the tightening corset of restraint she laced over her heart each morning. Grief, she had learned, made a woman pitied. Dignity kept her feared. The invitations dwindled. Her absence from the Winterton ball had not gone unnoticed, and neither had her refusal to attend the Langley musicale or the Randolph luncheon. But even as her name disappeared from the guest lists, her story, or rather the version whispered over tea, spread with relentless fervor. Poor Mrs. Winslow, so delicate lately. I heard she's suffering from nerves. It's the silence that speaks loudest. Her husband's doing his best, I'm told. She attended the Huntington sisters' tea, despite every instinct screaming for withdrawal. The drawing room was drenched in violet satin and overly sweet perfumes. Ladies fluttered around her like moths around a flame they feared yet longed to touch. Tabitha stood beside the mantel, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the rim of her teacup. She said little. She watched. In the corner, near the lemon cakes and cut-glass decanters, a pair of debutantes giggled behind fans. "She hasn't been seen since the Langley affair." "Do you think it's true? About Evelyn?" "Oh, darling. When has Evelyn ever entered a room without a scandal trailing behind her?" Their laughter was soft but surgical. Tabitha took another sip of her tea and allowed herself a single, slow breath. She turned away before the heat in her chest could reach her eyes. As she moved toward the bay window, a voice called her name. "Mrs. Winslow." The speaker was tall, older, and cloaked in a velvet shawl the color of dusk. "Mrs. Henrietta Langley, widow of Admiral Langley, matriarch of impeccable bloodlines, and a woman who could shatter a reputation with the lift of an eyebrow." Tabitha curtsied faintly. "May I speak with you, my dear?" the woman asked. They moved to a smaller sitting room, draped in forget-me-not blue, where a fire cracked behind an iron grate. "I've known many women, Tabitha," the elder said without preamble, "and I've seen what society does to those who vanish. It forgets them. No scandal needed. No death, just silence. That's all it takes." Tabitha said nothing, but her throat tightened. Henrietta reached out, placing a gloved hand lightly atop hers. "You must not disappear." It was not advice. It was a command, wrapped in velvet. That same afternoon, as she descended the steps of the Huntington home and stepped into the crisp winter air, Tabitha saw him. He stood across the street, just beyond the wrought iron fence, watching the line of carriages with a distance in his gaze that made the world blur around him. His overcoat was black, long, perfectly tailored. A dark Homburg hat shaded his eyes, but she saw them still, pale as winter steel, watching, unblinking. Sebastian Blackwell. She had heard the name. Everyone had. The financier who had withdrawn from society after the death of his wife. The man who never smiled, who never danced, whose fortune grew quietly while others boasted of theirs. He did not stare. He merely looked, like a portrait of silence come to life. For reasons she could not name, Tabitha's breath caught. Their eyes met, and though it lasted only a moment, it was enough to stir something within her that she had believed frozen. She turned away first. A coachman opened her carriage door. She entered without haste, without faltering. But inside, her heart had shifted. That evening, Charles did not return home. The parlour remained dark, the hearth unlit. She sat alone beneath the chandelier, a single oil lamp casting gold over her embroidery, though her needle barely moved. Her mind wandered back to Mrs. Langley's words, to the murmurings of the debutantes, to the man who had looked at her without expectation, without judgment, without pity. She rose and walked slowly to the music room. It had once been her favourite space, where sunlight painted patterns on the floorboards in spring, where Charles would sometimes sit behind her as she played, his hand on her shoulder. Now it smelled of old paper and neglect. She sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she played. Not a song for company, not a melody for show. A private piece, her own. The notes were hesitant at first, fragile as snowflakes, then firmer, clearer. It was not a beautiful tune. It was raw and unfinished, like the ache inside her, and yet in that moment it was hers. She did not know that the maid passing the corridor would pause to listen, or that the butler would dim the lamps just enough to let the music live in the air a little longer. She only knew that for the first time since the storm, she had touched the edge of herself again, and in that quiet exile, she was no longer invisible. She was waiting. The carriages lined the edge of Washington Square like sentinels wrapped in steam and snow. Their wheels hissed on the slush-covered cobblestones, releasing guests in silks and furs into the brilliance of the Langley mansion. Gaslight flickered beneath crystal sconces, casting soft halos over white shoulders and jewel-toned brocades. Inside, music fluttered from the ballroom in sweet, glittering waves, the first waltz of the evening rising with practiced elegance. Tabitha Winslow stood at the top of the wide staircase, one gloved hand resting on the velvet railing. Her breath was steady, but her heart beat like a war drum beneath the champagne silk of her gown. She wore her hair in a softly swept Gibson style, anchored by a pearl comb. A single string of pearls encircled her throat. The bodice of her dress shimmered subtly under the chandeliers, not with excess, but with quiet dignity. She had not intended to attend the soirée, but Mrs. Langley's hand-delivered note, penned in tight, assertive script, had left her little choice. "Appear," it had read, "or be erased." Tabitha had understood. She descended slowly, aware of every pair of eyes that turned toward her, aware of the gasps that hovered just behind painted fans and embroidered sleeves. She was not supposed to be here. She had been cast in whispers as the sickly wife, the fragile shadow. Her presence now unsettled them. She walked past silk whispers and swallowed laughter, each step both punishment and power. And then, as if conjured by cruelty, she saw them. Charles stood near the hearth, his coat removed, waistcoat gleaming with the golden thread of a man desperate to remain admired. His arm was casually draped around the back of a rose velvet settee. Evelyn Pierce sat beside him, one leg crossed delicately over the other, a glass of champagne poised between pale fingers. Her honey-blonde hair was twisted into elaborate curls, crowned with a cluster of white ostrich feathers. She wore a blush-pink satin gown with a plunging neckline meant to provoke. When she turned her head and saw Tabitha, her smile bloomed slowly, like poison spreading in tea. They had come together, brazenly, publicly. The room responded with a wave of tension. Some watched in anticipation, others looked away. Tabitha did not falter. She moved past the hearth, past them, her chin high, her gaze serene. She took a glass from the tray of a passing footman and sipped once, though her throat was dry as parchment. Her gloved hand did not tremble. Her spine remained straight. She would not offer them the luxury of reaction. But Evelyn had not come to remain ignored. "Tabitha," she purred, rising from the settee with the grace of a serpent in silk. "How brave of you to join us this evening. I hadn't realized you were well enough for company." The statement fell like ice on silver. Tabitha turned, her expression unreadable. "I thank you for your concern," she said softly. "I assure you, I am not as fragile as I once appeared." A ripple of awareness moved through the surrounding guests. Evelyn smiled wider, her eyes gleaming. "Charles has been simply beside himself with worry. You know how tender-hearted he is." Tabitha's gaze did not leave hers. "I am familiar with many of his qualities," she replied. "Tenderness was never among them." The air between them crackled. A hush spread. And then a voice, deep, calm, resonant. "Mrs. Winslow." Tabitha turned. Sebastian Blackwell stood behind her, tall and silent in his midnight suit, his gloved hand extended in a gesture both gallant and intimate. He bowed slightly, but his gaze never left hers. "May I have this dance?" For one moment she could not breathe. All around them, the ballroom watched. She placed her hand in his. He led her to the center of the marble floor, where couples were already forming under the light of the chandeliers. The orchestra paused, then began again, a slow, graceful waltz that rose like wind over the sea. Sebastian's arm settled gently around her waist. His other hand held hers with deliberate care. They began to move, not with showmanship, but with quiet synchronicity, as though they had danced this way many times before, in another life or another dream. Tabitha's heart beat fiercely in her chest, but her steps were sure. She allowed herself to breathe him in, his presence, his restraint, the safety wrapped in silence. "You did not have to," she whispered as they turned beneath the crystal light. "I know," he replied. They moved as one, his hands steady at her back, his gaze locked to hers with intensity that left no room for pretense. She felt the weight of every eye upon them, but none of it mattered. In that moment, the humiliation that had been crafted for her dissolved like mist. In that moment, she was no longer the betrayed wife. She was the woman he chose to lead into the dance. When the music ended, Sebastian bowed over her hand with slow reverence. Tabitha stepped back, and as she looked across the ballroom, she saw Evelyn's face, pale, lips tight, eyes burning. Charles stood behind her, his expression unreadable, but his fists were clenched. The crowd, ever hungry for a shift in the wind, turned its attention, not to scandal, but to admiration. Tabitha curtsied once, graciously, and withdrew to the edge of the room. Sebastian did not follow. He had done what was necessary. That night, long after the last waltz faded, the gossip that left the Langley mansion was not of Evelyn's gown or Charles's smirk. It was of a woman wrapped in pearls and dignity, a woman who did not crumble, a woman who danced. It began with a book, a modest volume of poetry bound in worn green leather and smelling faintly of lavender and dust. Tabitha found it one morning on the marble bench of her solarium, placed with deliberate care beneath a sprig of winter jasmine. There was no note, no inscription, only a pressed violet between the pages and a small engraved symbol on the inside cover, the interlocked initials SB. She did not have to ask how it got there. In the days that followed the Langley soiree, the world had grown quieter again, but it was no longer the silence of exile. It was the silence of something unspoken taking root. Sebastian Blackwell began appearing in discreet intervals, once every fortnight at first, then weekly, always under the guise of returning or exchanging books. Byron, Wordsworth, Ovid. He said little, but he listened, with a stillness that was more intimate than speech. Tabitha would receive him in the second parlour, the smaller one where the heavy curtains could be drawn against the street and where the fire remained lit, even during daylight. She would sit near the hearth, he in the corner armchair, and between them sat not tension, but an exquisite restraint. He never spoke of Charles. She never mentioned Evelyn. There was no need. They spoke instead of music, of snowfall, of ancient epics and watercolor landscapes, of the scent of lilacs in May. She spoke more with her eyes than her mouth, and he understood her silences with unsettling accuracy. One afternoon, as she returned him a volume of Keats, her hand lingered a second too long on the cover. He did not move, but his gaze rose to meet hers, and in that single moment, the breath left her chest. It was not desire that stirred in her, it was recognition. He set the book aside. "My wife," he said, his voice low and even, "was named Clara. She died 4 years ago this spring. Influenza. It began with a cough and ended with quiet." Tabitha did not look away. "I buried her in Boston. That was where she was born. She loved violets and Italian sculpture. She hated opera. She believed in ghosts." He looked down for a long moment, then raised his eyes to hers again. "I never imagined I would care again. I made peace with that." The words were not a confession. They were a yielding. Tabitha did not offer condolences. She only inclined her head. "My grief is not the same as yours," she said at last. "But I know what it is to lose something and keep living." The moment passed, but left a trace behind it, like a fingerprint on glass. That same week, Charles grew bold. It began with small violations. Evelyn's perfume in the hallway, her glove carelessly dropped in the vestibule, then laughter behind the library doors, a shawl draped over the back of a chair in the drawing room that did not belong to Tabitha. One evening, she returned from a visit with Mrs. Langley to find the second-floor gallery filled with noise, laughter, music. She climbed the stairs slowly. In the sitting room stood Charles, glass in hand, arm wrapped around Evelyn, who perched atop the piano like a courtesan in an operetta. A cluster of lesser acquaintances, men with over-polished shoes and too loud voices, applauded as she sang an off-key verse from a French cabaret. Tabitha paused at the threshold. The door had not even been closed. Charles noticed her first. "Ah, the Queen of Silence arrives," he said, his smile sharp. "Shall we pour her a glass?" Evelyn giggled. Tabitha's voice was calm. "This is not a brothel, Charles." Gasps fluttered like startled birds. He stepped forward, amusement draining from his face. "I've tolerated your coldness, your mood swings, your drama long enough," he hissed under his breath. "But if you think you can continue living under this roof and leeching off my fortune while clutching your little virtue like a shield, you are sorely mistaken." Tabitha's voice remained composed. "Then let us settle it." His eyes narrowed. "I propose a divorce," he said. "You walk away with your dignity. I keep the estate and accounts, and no one needs to suffer public disgrace." She regarded him for a long time, her face unreadable. And then, in the quietest voice imaginable, she replied, "I will not pay to erase what you broke." He stepped closer. "You're clinging to scraps, Tabitha. No one will stand for you." She met his gaze without blinking. "Then I will stand alone." She turned and descended the staircase without a backward glance. That night, the wind howled through the shutters, rattling the windows like ghostly hands. She sat in the music room, the same room Evelyn had desecrated with false gaiety. She sat there for hours, watching the fire, her hands resting in her lap, the hem of her gown dusted with ash. When Sebastian arrived the next morning, he said nothing. He simply handed her a worn book of Sappho's fragments. She opened it to find a single line marked with graphite. "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." She looked up at him. "I do not need protection," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I will not be erased. No one could erase you." She closed the book gently and laid it against her chest. Outside, the city prepared for another snowstorm. Inside, two people sat in a room full of unspoken truths. And though the fire burned low, it was enough. For now. The day had started with unexpected sun. After a string of snow-heavy mornings and frost-bitten afternoons, the light came as a quiet miracle. Gold melting across the stone facades of Fifth Avenue, catching on iron railings and window panes, brushing its warmth along the city's cold edges. But inside the Winslow residence, the light fell differently. It entered like an uninvited guest, cautious, hovering, never quite touching the shadows that lived behind the brocade curtains. Tabitha stood in the solarium, her gloved hands wrapped around a cup of bergamot tea, its perfume rising toward her face like a memory. She wore a high-necked walking gown in soft dove grey, its skirt trimmed in darker velvet, and her hair was pinned in a looser style than usual, strands escaping to frame her cheekbones with an almost girlish softness. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the tall clock in the hall, the same one that had marked the hours of her loneliness, her clarity, her change. She did not expect Sebastian that day. His visits had followed no pattern, and yet she had begun to sense them before they occurred. In the stillness of her breath, in the particular ache behind her ribs, in the way her fingers hesitated on the page of a book she had already read twice. It was not longing, not exactly. It was presence. And when the butler arrived to announce him, she only nodded. He stepped into the room with the same economy of movement that always defined him. Precise, assured, composed. He removed his gloves slowly, his coat remaining on, as though he meant to stay no longer than a moment. "I was walking near the park," he said quietly, "and the sun made me restless." Tabitha gestured toward the chair across from hers. "Restlessness has become rather fashionable this season." His lips curved slightly at that, but the smile did not reach his eyes. He sat, the silence stretched between them, not awkward, not cold, simply full. She poured him tea. As she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his. The contact was brief but electric, as though the room itself had inhaled. She felt the heat travel up her arm, settle in her chest. He did not pull away. They spoke of mundane things. The book he had finished, the snow that had melted too soon, a painting he had seen in a gallery window. But beneath each exchange was a current that pulsed louder than words. When he rose to leave, he reached for his gloves and, in doing so, dislodged a small object from the inner pocket of his coat. It fell with a muted clink to the carpet. Tabitha bent to retrieve it. A pocket watch. Gold, worn at the edges, its chain delicate and gleaming in the morning light. She picked it up carefully, the metal warm in her palm, and turned it slightly. The clasp was loose. As she tilted it, the locket popped open. Inside was a miniature portrait, no larger than a thumbprint, of a woman with pale eyes and dark hair, her features fine and composed, her expression caught in that strange middle space between joy and solemnity. Tabitha froze. She did not speak, but her gaze held the image. When she looked up, Sebastian's face had changed. He was no longer composed, no longer the untouchable man of granite and steel. His eyes, always so guarded, were now wide, vulnerable. He stepped forward. "I didn't mean for you to see that." Tabitha held the watch out to him with both hands. "She's very beautiful." His fingers wrapped around the object slowly, but he did not close it. He looked down at the portrait as though seeing it for the first time in years. "Clara," he said, the name like a breath dragged from a wound. We were married for 7 years. She died in the spring. It was quiet. She fell ill, and by the time the fever broke, her lungs had already failed. She smiled the day before she passed. I thought that meant she would recover, but I was wrong. He closed the watch gently, the click of the clasp soft and final. I stopped carrying it for a time. Then I found myself needing to hear the tick again, as if it could keep her memory alive. Foolish, perhaps. Tabitha did not speak. Sebastian continued, though his voice had dropped. I swore I would never feel again what I felt with her, and for a long time I didn't. I was faithful to her memory in a way I wasn't even faithful to myself. He looked at Tabitha then, truly looked at her, as if she were not merely a woman in a parlor, but a force that had entered his life without permission and rearranged the structure of his soul. But now, he said, I find myself drawn, not out of forgetfulness, not to replace her, but because there is something in you that makes silence easier to bear. Tabitha's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her throat felt tight, her heart pounded. She stepped closer, slowly, as though crossing sacred ground. Her hand reached out, not to touch him, but to steady herself on the edge of the chair. I won't replace her, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sebastian nodded. That's not what I want. They stood in silence, and then, slowly, reverently, he tucked the watch back into his coat pocket. He bowed slightly, his gaze lingering on her face as if memorizing it. Good day, Mrs. Winslow. She dipped her head. Good day, Mr. Blackwell. He left. The door closed softly behind him, and only then, only in the wake of his departure, did she realize that her hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of something beginning to form, something vast and unfamiliar, something neither of them had dared name. Yet, the days had grown longer, but the light seemed reluctant to touch the Winslow home. Though spring approached, Fifth Avenue remained cold, not with the bite of winter, but with something more insidious, more enduring. Inside the stone walls of the house that once held promise, tension had taken root like ivy creeping through old brickwork. Tabitha Winslow moved through the rooms with a grace that disguised the storm building within her. Her footsteps were measured, her gowns elegant and subdued, always in muted tones of slate, deep blue or dusk grey, never inviting colour, never permitting softness. She had become, in the eyes of society, something of a figure, not a scandal, not yet, but not untouched by one. She was a woman watched, a woman whispered about, and every whisper wrapped itself around her name like a shroud. It was in the late morning light of a Tuesday, pale and cold as porcelain, that Mrs. Henrietta Langley came to call. She arrived without fanfare, her carriage stopping beneath the marble arch with the efficiency of habit. Her butler announced her presence with solemn formality, though Tabitha had already risen from her embroidery chair the moment she heard the wheels. In the drawing-room, Mrs. Langley removed her gloves without speaking, placed them on her lap, and waited until tea had been poured and dismissed. Then she spoke. Charles, she said simply, has begun borrowing. Tabitha's expression did not change. He has always borrowed, from truth, from decency, from time. Mrs. Langley's gaze sharpened, not only from virtue, from banks, from investors, and, as I have reason to believe, from you. Tabitha's back stiffened slightly. I do not claim certainty, the older woman continued, but one does not host supper for 3 rail barons and a theatrical producer unless one is drowning, and one does not move funds freely unless one has access to ledgers that are not entirely his. Tabitha's hands folded in her lap, fingers tightening. You must look, Mrs. Langley said, before he ruins you too. That evening, Tabitha sat at her escritoire beneath the flickering gaslight and stared at her wedding portrait, the only one still hanging in the sitting room. Charles's arm encircled her waist, her face angled upward with a youthful hope that now seemed impossible to remember. She studied her own eyes in the painting and no longer recognized them. The next morning she sent for Mr. Auden, the solicitor her father had once trusted, a man well into his 60s with a stiff collar and a conscience sharpened by decades in court. Under the guise of auditing the estate's expenses, he requested access to the household financial records. Charles was not home when the ledgers were retrieved from the locked cabinet in his study, but Tabitha was. She sat beside Mr. Auden as he turned the pages with gloved hands and a furrowed brow. He said little, but each page seemed to deepen the lines around his mouth. At last he looked up. "You signed none of this?" Tabitha leaned forward. "No." He turned the ledger toward her. On the page were 3 transfers, sizable, all in her name, all bearing her signature. But the handwriting was only a pale mimicry of hers, close enough to pass at a glance, far enough to betray its forgery under scrutiny. Below them, 2 bank drafts carried her initials, and below that, a promissory note for a sum large enough to hollow the estate. Mr. Auden exhaled slowly. "If you wish to pursue this." "I do," she said. And with those 2 words, something shifted inside her, something cold and clear and irreversible. When Charles returned that evening, she was waiting in his study. She wore a gown of deep green wool, severe in cut, with jet buttons climbing to her throat. Her hair was pulled back without ornament. Her gloves rested on the desk beside her. He entered with the usual rustle of indifference, but when he saw her posture, her hands folded, her chin high, her eyes steady, he hesitated. "Tabitha, I found the ledgers," she said. He said nothing. "I saw the signatures." Still, silence. "I never imagined you would betray me in ink as well as in flesh." Charles moved to the decanter, poured himself a glass of brandy with the flourish of a man pretending control. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. Tabitha rose slowly and crossed to him. She stopped only when they were a breath apart. "You stole from me." He laughed. "Stole? I borrowed. It's all shared, isn't it? Or is that vow null as well? I never vowed to fund your cowardice." He sipped, shrugged. "You think anyone will care if you cry forgery? The courts will side with me. They always do." Her voice, when it came, was soft, dangerous. "I am not the one who shared a bed with betrayal." His eyes narrowed. "I can make this ugly for you. You already have." For a moment nothing moved between them but air. Then Tabitha stepped back, reclaiming her gloves. "You will return every cent," she said. "You will leave the accounts. And you will not attempt to disgrace me further." "And if I do?" he asked, voice low. She turned to the door. "Then I will make you a cautionary tale." That night, a carriage stopped outside the Winslow residence just after 9. No one saw who left the velvet box at the door. But when Tabitha found it and brought it into the light, her breath caught. Inside, resting against deep blue lining, was a pearl pin, simple, luminous, dignified. Beneath it, a folded note, written in a familiar hand. "For your voice. Wear it when you speak." She touched the pin with trembling fingers, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not for joy, but for resolve. The invitation arrived without a signature. It was delivered in the early afternoon by a boy in a blue cap who offered no name and no explanation. Tabitha received it in the vestibule, still wearing her writing gloves, the scent of dried ink clinging to her fingertips. The envelope was heavy, sealed in red wax, bearing the crest of the Huntington family, one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most formidable names in Manhattan society. Her hands remained steady as she opened it. The card inside was thick, cream-colored, and etched in gold. "Mrs. Tabitha Winslow is cordially invited to the Huntington Spring Ball, Friday the 15th of April at 7 o'clock. Formal attire requested. Attendance expected." There was no note, no name, but she knew who had sent it. Later, as twilight bled across the city and gaslights blinked to life along the avenues, Tabitha stood before her mirror, still holding the card, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Langley had intervened again, not with force, but with precision. Tabitha reached for the small velvet box resting on her vanity and opened it to reveal the pearl pin Sebastian had left for her days earlier. She lifted it slowly and affixed it to the high neckline of her gown. The dress itself was champagne silk, soft as breath, with a bodice trimmed in delicate lace and a sweeping skirt that whispered with every step. Her hair was arranged in a low chignon, a few loose tendrils framing her face. There were no jewels, no diamonds, no emeralds, only the pearl at her throat, gleaming softly like a vow not yet spoken. When the carriage arrived, she climbed in alone, and as the horses pulled her toward the grandest ballroom in the city, Tabitha Winslow prepared to walk once more into the fire. The Huntington mansion stood 3 stories tall, its facade lit by gas lamps and lined with carriages waiting their turn. Inside, chandeliers glittered like constellations, and the ballroom pulsed with music and laughter. The elite had gathered in full regalia, silk gloves, sapphire tiaras, waistcoats with gold filigree. Conversations floated like perfume, light and laced with malice. The moment Tabitha entered, a hush fell over the crowd. She did not falter. She stepped into the room with the grace of a woman who had learned to carry silence like armor. The hem of her gown brushed the marble floor with every measured step. Her eyes, clear and calm, did not scan the room for allies. She had come prepared to stand alone, but she was not alone for long. Evelyn Pierce spotted her first. The woman descended upon her like a swan with sharpened wings, dressed in layers of rose satin and diamonds far too bright for such a delicate neck. Her voice, saccharine and loud, cut through the waltz, echoing in the background. "Well," Evelyn drawled, loud enough for those nearest to pause, "I didn't realize the guest list had become so charitable." Tabitha turned to her slowly. Their eyes met. The crowd circled like wolves smelling blood. Evelyn's lips curled into something that might have been a smile had it not been soaked in venom. "Did you lose your way, darling? Or have you come to observe what grace truly looks like?" Tabitha opened her mouth, but before a word could leave it, a voice spoke behind her. Deep, steady, unmistakable. She came as herself, which is more than can be said of most here. The crowd parted as Sebastian Blackwell stepped forward. He was dressed in a midnight tailcoat, black cravat pinned with a single opal, his gloved hand extended not in pity, but in offering. Tabitha looked at him, and in that moment, the stillness between them told the truth. He was not saving her. He was standing beside her. She placed her hand in his. Together, they turned. And just before they walked away, Tabitha met Evelyn's gaze one last time and said, her voice cool and crystalline, "Some women rise quietly, that is all." The words landed like glass shattering over porcelain. They moved to the dance floor, and as the music resumed, the room shifted with them. Gossip turned to admiration, curiosity bent into awe. They danced once, with the restraint of 1,000 unspoken things. His hand at her back was nothing more than support, but she could feel the tension it carried, the ache of distance, the fear of hope. Their eyes met briefly, and the pain in his was not born of longing, but of waiting. When the waltz ended, they stepped apart. He did not speak again, not in the ballroom. But as the night drew to a close, and he escorted her to her carriage beneath the flickering gas lamps of the street, he paused. His hand lingered near hers, not touching, but close enough for her skin to feel the heat of his restraint. His voice was low. "When you are ready," he said, "I am here." She did not answer. She did not need to. Her fingers brushed his barely, like a breath against the edge of night, and then she stepped into the carriage, the door closed, and the horse pulled her away. But this time, she did not feel alone. The air had softened. The snow had melted from the streets, leaving cobblestones glistening in the morning light. Pale crocuses bloomed shyly in iron-railed gardens, and the carriages along Fifth Avenue no longer creaked with frost, but rolled with an ease that betrayed the season's quiet turning. Within the Winslow household, however, the change of season brought no bloom. After the Huntington ball, Tabitha had not attended another soirée. She had not accepted invitations, not even from Mrs. Langley, and she had not walked the fashionable promenades of Central Park, where society paraded its silks and scandals beneath budding trees. Instead, she withdrew, not in shame, not in mourning, but in purpose. She spent her mornings in the conservatory, where the light filtered through lace-curtained windows onto her writing desk. Her hands, once idle with embroidery or gently poised on sheet music, now moved with deliberate ink strokes across thick cream paper. She drafted proposals, wrote letters to philanthropic patrons, copied statistics from census books, and penned her vision with elegant clarity. A school, a place where young women, those with no dowries, no patrons, no surnames worth mentioning, could learn to read contracts, balance accounts, sew with intention, and type on the new Remington machines that were slowly appearing in government offices. A place where ambition was not shamed, but shaped. She had once believed her path was sewn into her hemline, delicate, decorative, and confined to drawing rooms. But now she saw the absence of choice for what it was, and she would not let that silence pass to others. Her meetings with Sebastian became rare, not cold, but deliberate. He did not press, and she did not flee. Their bond, forged in fire and frost, lived now in restrained glances and the occasional arrival of a book left at her doorstep, always unannounced. It was on one such afternoon, beneath the soft hush of late April rain, that he came. No appointment, no pretext, only his presence in the doorway of her study, his hat in his hand, his expression unreadable. She stood to greet him, a small smile curving her lips. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. "Mrs. Winslow." He did not move farther into the room, though she gestured toward the chair opposite her writing desk. "I won't stay," he said. "I only came to return this." He held up a book, Cicero's On Duty, its pages well-worn, the spine smoothed from careful handling. She took it gently. "You could have sent it." "I could have." She waited. And then, after a breath too long to be casual, he said, "I've heard from Mr. Auden. You're seeking a building." She nodded. "An old rectory on East 10th. The rent is manageable." He hesitated. "You'll need funding." "I'm preparing proposals. I've written to the Ladies' Benevolent Committee and the Women's Employment League. Mrs. Langley is considering an introduction to the Railroad Widows' Trust." There was pride in her tone, but no boast, only certainty and a growing fire beneath it. Sebastian took another breath, then stepped toward the window. The light touched the edge of his profile, casting his features in gentle relief. The sharp jaw, the shadow beneath his cheekbones, the line between his brows that never quite faded. "You've done more in 2 months than most do in 2 years. Tabitha's fingers traced the spine of the book. "I spent a long time being nothing but ornament. Now I would like to be useful." He turned to her then, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she could not name. Admiration, longing, restraint, grief, perhaps all of it. "I think of you," he said quietly, "more than I should." Her breath caught. "I see you," he continued, walking alone on that ballroom floor. "I see your hands wrapped around books no one expects you to understand. I see your voice in the silence, and I think to myself, I was never meant to feel again, but then I do." The rain outside fell more steadily now, drumming lightly against the window panes. Tabitha rose slowly, her heart thundering beneath her bodice. She crossed to stand beside him, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with the gentlest of tones, she said, "I must stand before I reach." He looked at her, pain blooming softly in his gaze, not rejection, but recognition. "I know," he said. She reached for his hand, not to hold it, but to brush her fingertips against his knuckles. The touch lasted only a second, but it was a promise, a vow still waiting for its time. He bowed his head and stepped back. He did not speak again. He left the way he came, without sound, without certainty, with the weight of a man holding his heart in his pocket. That night, in his study lit only by the amber glow of a single lamp, Sebastian Blackwell opened the drawer that had remained locked for 4 years. Inside lay the portrait of Clara, his late wife, painted in miniature and framed in mother of pearl. He looked at her face for a long time, longer than he had in months. Then, with reverence and peace, he closed the drawer, and this time he turned the key. Outside, the rain whispered across the rooftops of New York, washing the city clean. And somewhere, in a quiet room filled with paper and purpose, Tabitha Winslow dipped her pen again in ink and wrote the first sentence of a proposal that would carry her name. Not as a wife, not as a scandal, but as herself. New York, early March of 1889. The streets near Wall Street buzzed with quiet dread, a hum of scandal brewing just beneath the starch of every newspaper collar and silk hat. The snow that once blanketed the city in a deceptive hush had given way to thawing slush, as if the very cobblestones were shedding their illusions. Tabitha Winslow stood by the parlor window of her temporary residence on Gramercy Park South. The fire behind her crackled, its warmth indifferent to the chill gathering in the world outside. In her gloved hands rested the morning edition of the New York Evening Herald. Her name did not appear, not yet, but her husband's did. Winslow and Company under investigation, discrepancies found in ledgers. She read the article twice, not because she doubted its truth, but because it was surreal to see justice, however delayed, finally stretch its fingers toward a man who had, for so long, walked untouched by consequence. Behind her, a soft clatter disturbed the quiet. Mrs. Langley had just returned from her afternoon call. The older woman removed her gloves with practiced dignity and glanced at the paper. So, the reckoning arrives. Her voice was calm but not unkind. Tabitha folded the paper with precise movements. He used my name, my dowry, my trust. And now he must answer for it, Mrs. Langley said. As you once did, but in silence. Tabitha did not reply. She had no desire to gloat. She felt no triumph, only a strange, aching clarity, as if her bones had been carrying a weight she hadn't realized until it was gone. Later that evening, a knock came at the front door. Charles Winslow. He was not the man who had once stood at the altar beside her with a ring of promise. He looked smaller now, his wool coat dusted with melting snow, eyes wild with desperation, as though hoping charm might still purchase salvation. "Tabitha," he said, stepping into the vestibule without waiting for permission. "They're twisting everything. It's not as it seems." She closed the door behind him but did not remove her gloves. "I don't care how it seems, Charles. I care how it is." He flinched. "You know what the press can do, what this will mean for the firm, for you," she corrected gently, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "It means ruin for you." He paced like a man caged. "They're looking into the ledgers, the same ones you insisted on reading." His voice grew accusatory. "You planted this." Tabitha raised her chin. "I uncovered it. There is a difference." He stared at her then, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time in years. She was no longer the compliant hostess who smiled through dinner parties and kept her pain folded within her skirts. This was a woman sculpted by betrayal, polished by indignity, and made luminous by dignity reclaimed. "Tabitha, please," he murmured. "They'll destroy me. Just say you misunderstood. Say you signed those drafts willingly." She gazed at him for a long moment, then stepped aside and gestured to the door. "You erased me when I was useful. I will not save you now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Charles straightened, something like anger flickering across his features, not at the injustice, but at her refusal to play the game he'd always won. Without another word, he walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Snowflakes scattered from his shoulders and melted where he'd stood. That night, Tabitha filed for divorce. It was not done in secrecy. She wanted no shadows this time, no whispered rumors behind teacups. The paperwork was delivered to the court by mid-morning. By noon, the society columns trembled with the news. The woman once whispered about with pity was now spoken of with awe. "Mrs. Winslow seeks independence amid scandal," read one headline. In her quiet suite, Tabitha read none of them. Instead, she reviewed the architectural sketches for what would become the Winslow School for Independent Women. Her school, her dream. She envisioned gas lamps lighting long reading halls, women leaning over ledgers with the same command she had once fought to learn in secret. She imagined futures rewritten. That evening, a letter arrived without return address. Inside, a newspaper clipping and nothing more. She unfolded it slowly. "Winslow divorce filed," was the headline. And beneath it, in careful, elegant handwriting, "I hope you know you were never invisible to me." There was no signature, but she recognized the ink, the steadiness of it, the restraint. Sebastian Blackwell. She pressed the paper to her chest for a moment, then folded it gently and placed it atop her writing desk. She did not respond. Not yet. Across town, in a quiet library lit by oil lamps and flanked by dark oak shelves, Sebastian sat reading the same paper, his expression unreadable, his hand tightening slightly on the edge as he read her name. Not as a social ornament, not as a wife, but as a woman reclaiming her narrative. He folded the paper with reverence, as if it were sacred. "I do not know," he whispered into the stillness, "if there is still a place for me in her world." And yet he kept the clipping. Tabitha, meanwhile, stood at the edge of her newly rented garden, modest, wild, with spring peeking through the soil. She looked not at what was gone, but at what might grow. As the gas lamps flickered on along the avenues and the carriages continued to rattle past, the city, like 1,000 watchful eyes, turned toward her, not with scorn, but with the hush that follows when something or someone begins again. And this time, Tabitha Winslow was writing the story herself. The first day of spring arrived with no fanfare, just the subtle shift in the air, the gentlest coaxing of green at the edges of brown. On the corner of Lexington Avenue, where the frost had once claimed every bud with indifference, crocuses now fought their way through the thaw. New York had softened, just slightly. But inside the converted brownstone on East 64th Street, the atmosphere was anything but tentative. The Winslow School for Independent Women opened its doors to the sound of polished shoes across stone steps, the rustle of new books being arranged on tables, and the careful breath of possibility. It had taken months of meticulous planning, months of navigating the fine print of trustees, of convincing benefactors without begging, of taking each indignity thrown by former social acquaintances and transforming it into silent fuel. Tabitha Winslow stood at the front of the assembly room, her posture straight, her dress simple yet deliberate, dove-grey silk trimmed in palest blue. Her hair was pinned in a soft, unfussy chignon, and at her collar sat the pearl pin Sebastian had once given her, no longer a token of encouragement, but now a symbol reclaimed, a voice earned. The seats were filled not with society's wives or heiresses, but with women who had worked in laundries, in sewing rooms, in back offices, where their hands were seen, but their minds ignored. Some wore gloves with mended seams, others had eyes too tired for their age. But all looked toward Tabitha with the cautious hope of those not used to being invited into any room with chandeliers. She did not speak long. She did not need to. "We were taught to be graceful," she began, her voice clear, each word paced as if she were stitching a hem. "But we were not taught to stand. Let us now teach each other." A pause, as the silence folded over the words like velvet. Then applause, not thunderous, not theatrical, but steady, grateful. A few of the women smiled. One wiped her cheek and pretended she hadn't. As the guests mingled over tea and lemon cakes served without ceremony, Tabitha moved among them without pretense. She answered questions about the curriculum, reading, writing, commerce, public speaking, but her eyes often flicked to the back of the room where she had noticed him. Sebastian Blackwell had entered quietly, as always. He stood with his gloved hands behind his back, dressed in a tailored black coat that had seen better days but still carried dignity. His dark eyes found her from a distance, but did not call attention to themselves. He had not sent word ahead. She had not expected him, and yet he was there, not as a suitor, not as a rescuer, but as a witness. Their eyes met once. He inclined his head. Nothing more. Hours passed. Chairs were stacked. Voices faded. By late afternoon, the halls had emptied, leaving only the faint echo of shoes on parquet and the scent of beeswax and tea. Tabitha remained alone in the lecture room, rearranging a vase of tulips that drooped slightly. She touched the petals with the same care she had once used to smooth crumpled pages in the guest room of a house that no longer belonged to her. Behind her, a presence. She did not startle. "I was told the headmistress might still be found guarding her tulips," came Sebastian's voice, low and warm, with restrained mirth. She turned, slowly. He stood in the doorway, holding his hat in his hands, as if unsure whether he was permitted to stay. Tabitha regarded him without smiling, though her heart was not so composed. "Did you come to enroll?" "No, though I would gladly fail the entrance exam if it meant your correction." His expression was gentle, but his eyes held something deeper, not flirtation but reverence, the kind of look that saw not only what had bloomed, but what had been burned away. They stood there for a moment, two people who had learned to wait without promises. He stepped forward slowly, and she did not move. "I read the notice," he said. "The divorce. I assumed you would," she replied. He nodded, then lowered his gaze, as though it were not just ink on a page, but a wound reopened. "I didn't know if I should come. You didn't ask to be part of this," she said softly. "You were simply kind." His lips curved slightly. "I was never only kind." The admission made the silence hum. Tabitha looked down at her hands, still lightly clasped. They had once trembled when passing a watch back to him. Now they were steady. "I did not come to make a plea," he said, stepping closer until they stood just apart. "Only to offer something, and to accept whatever answer you give." Then he extended his hand. No speech, no declarations, only that. Tabitha looked at it, at the fingers that had once brushed against hers in the cold, that had helped her lift ledgers and open windows, that had never once closed around hers without permission. Her eyes welled, not from sorrow but from the sharp beauty of being offered a choice. She placed her hand in his, not out of need, but out of want. Outside, the afternoon light dimmed. As they stepped beyond the doors of the school, the sky had begun to weep, not with rain, but with the gentlest snow, untimely for spring, but soft as lace on their shoulders. They walked without words. New York, with all its noise, seemed hushed. The gas lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Around them, the city pulsed with lives that would never know what passed between a woman in grey and a man who had waited without demanding. At the corner, he offered his arm. She took it lightly, and together they continued, not as saviors, but as equals. The city had changed. 6 springs had passed since Tabitha Winslow last stood in the drawing room of her Fifth Avenue home, the one she had once shared with silence, betrayal, and cold fireplaces. New structures now rose along the skyline, taller, bolder, but none more meaningful to her than the modest red-brick building on the corner of Madison and 39th, where the doors of the Winslow School for Independent Women opened each morning with the scent of ink, chalk, and purpose. Inside, young women studied accounting, rhetoric, and the law. Girls who once might have become someone's ornament now sharpened their voices like tools. On the first Monday of each month, Tabitha still arrived before dawn to light the front lamps herself, not out of obligation, but reverence. The school had become more than a mission. It was a lighthouse for those who had once, like her, been left in the dark. That morning, as snow began to melt on the steps, she paused to watch a group of students bustle past, their gloves damp and spirits bright. Her reflection in the glass door surprised her. The streaks of silver in her hair had grown bolder, not unbecoming, just honest. Time had not softened her, but it had sculpted her differently, firmer in resolve, gentler in judgment. Behind her, a voice, warm, low, stirred the silence. "You're up before the sun again." She turned. Sebastian. His presence no longer startled her heart. It steadied it. 6 years had not made their bond louder, only deeper. They had not married. There had been no proposal, no declarations. What they shared lived not in ceremony, but in the way his coat was always hung beside hers, in how he knew her silences, in the way he touched her back lightly when she seemed overwhelmed, or left letters on her desk in the middle of the night, signed only with an S and a pressed violet. He stepped beside her now, offering a steaming cup of coffee without speaking. She took it, nodding once, her gloved fingers brushing his, a touch that still meant everything. Elsewhere, the world had moved on. Evelyn Pierce had returned to Philadelphia under her maiden name and was seen occasionally at luncheons hosted by widows too discreet to ask about past scandals. Charles Winslow, disgraced and bankrupt, had vanished from the social record. His portrait quietly removed from several clubhouses, his name omitted from foundation lists. Tabitha did not speak of him, nor did she need to. His absence from her life had become her greatest gift to herself. And Mrs. Langley, dear sharp-tongued Mrs. Langley, had passed the previous winter, her will leaving a generous endowment to the school and a note addressed to Tabitha, written in a firm, unwavering hand. "You stood. I'm proud of you." The city's whispers had quieted over time. What once had been scandal became legacy. Young women now spoke of the Tabitha years, a phrase coined by a columnist in the Evening Tribune, as if they were a season of renewal, and they were. That afternoon, as the sun poured gold across the parquet floor of the school's main hall, Tabitha found herself alone in the assembly room. A student had left behind a book of poems, open to a page that spoke of rebirth and snow. She smiled faintly, remembering the snowstorm that had changed everything, the train she missed, the door she opened too soon, the quiet war she had chosen to win without bloodshed. Behind her, Sebastian moved to close the window, but she raised a hand. "Leave it," she said gently. "Let the wind in." Outside, flakes had begun to fall again. Spring snow, rare, fleeting, brushing against the earth like a whispered apology from winter. Tabitha stood, walking slowly toward him. He watched her, still as ever, until she reached him and placed her hand, gloveless now, against his chest. "I once thought I needed to survive alone," she murmured, "but I see now. I just needed to know I could." Sebastian brought his forehead to hers, eyes closed. "You never needed saving," he whispered. "No," she said, smiling, "but I welcomed being seen." And so, as the snow danced lightly through the open window, they stood in the quiet warmth of a room built for voices, surrounded by the future they had dared to imagine, not with grand gestures, but with small, brave choices, together, not as saviors, but as equals. Some stories are not just meant to be told, they are meant to be felt. Tabitha's journey was never about perfection or fairy tale endings. It was about resilience, about standing tall when the world expected her to kneel, about learning that love, when chosen freely, is not a rescue, it's a recognition. Her strength was not loud, it was quiet, steady, the kind that builds new paths for others to follow. And through each betrayal, each whispered doubt, she found her voice, not to shout, but to teach. And in doing so, she taught us something too. Perhaps you saw a part of yourself in her, or maybe you saw the courage of someone you love, If this story touched you in any way, write the word "stand" in the comments. Let it be a silent chorus for everyone who made it to the end, and a beacon for those still finding their strength. If you'd like to support the team who brings these stories to life, consider sending a super thanks in the amount you feel called to. Your support, in any form, means the world. And if that's not possible right now, simply sharing this video with a friend or loved one helps us more than you know. We invite you to explore other powerful period love stories, which I've left linked in the cards at the end of this video. Thank you for standing with Tabitha, and thank you for being part of this community where love, courage, and dignity always find a home.